Hi, and welcome to the second video on essential concepts for printing and prepress. The first video we talked about CMYK color builds and spot color. In this video we're going to look at bleed, overprint, knockout, registration, and trapping. The last two topics there, halftone screens and dot gain, will be in a different video. So to get started with, bleed. Bleed is a pretty common concept. You may already know what this is, but just to go back over it really quickly. Bleed is when you have a design or an object that goes to the edge of the page that you're designing. So it's a poster or a brochure or a page of a book. You have a background color such as this fish book with a green going to the edge of the page. We call that the trim size of the page. Now when you're designing it, you'll actually add in some extra space beyond the trim, and that's called the bleed. And you have your artwork extend out to the bleed so that when the cutter comes in production, so after it's been printed and the pages are folded or whatnot, and the cutter comes to chop it, that there's no chance of an error, and where a little white line might be showing up if the cut was not perfect. So bleed is a very common thing to do. If you have any artwork going to the edge of your page, you should build a bleed into it, and the standard for that is 1/8 of an inch. You don't need any more than that, and any less is a little too little. So 1/8 of an inch bleed, and it's the main factor, the main mistake that designers have or create when they send stuff off to the printer. The printer will say bleed. Designers still forget to add bleed, so just try to keep that in mind. The next two concepts, overprint and knockout, go hand in hand with each other. They are related to each other because they are opposites. So overprint has to do with one ink that is designed to print on top of another ink, or one object that is designed to print on top of another object. So in this case here with this cyan A and the magenta square, if you have overprint, if the A is set to overprint and you print it on top of the magenta, it's going to combine the inks together and you're going to get this bluish, purplish color. Whereas if you have the A set to knockout, so the A is on top of the magenta square and you have it set to knockout, it'll knock out any color below it so that that cyan A stays a pure cyan and it appears to have a magenta background. So that's a pretty simple concept, and you don't have to think about it too often because the default in InDesign and Illustrator is for objects to knock each other out. So when you're designing something in Illustrator or InDesign and you have a background color and then you draw a circle on top of it and you fill that with a green, well, that green by default is going to knock out anything below it. It's not going to mix all the colors below it. You can set those objects to mix if you want. There is an overprint setting where you can have objects overprint. Not advised because you get unintended consequences. You don't really know what the color is going to turn out to be like when the inks do mix. So generally you're kind of covered, but it's good to know what overprint and knockout is. Sometimes a printer will ask you to make something overprint. That usually has to do with black lines, like 1-point lines, 2-point line, 1 or 2-point line or smaller. Those are good to overprint because if they try to knock out and then there might be a misregistration on color. For instance here, a text, if you have black text on top of a colored background, you want the black text to overprint because that reduces the chance of a misalignment. So you can see here this A, black A, is misaligned with the knockout behind it, and so it creates that white gap there, and that's a problem. So to resolve that, you just say, well, let's make that black A overprint, and there's no chance of there being a white line. At the same time, that black A's color isn't going to change because it's black on top of magenta. If anything, it becomes a richer black, a nicer black. So the general rule is that black text and black lines are usually set to overprint. And InDesign does that for you automatically. So I'll show you here in InDesign. If I come to InDesign and I got my swatches here, this black swatch that's got the brackets around it right there, that automatically overprints no matter what. Any other color will not overprint. Even this one here, that's a tint of the black swatch, that will knock out whatever's behind it. But this black swatch will overprint. By the way, while we're here, never use registration for black. Registration is 100% of all the inks, and that's too much ink coverage, and it is meant for a different purpose, but unfortunately InDesign will not let us delete it, so it has to stay there. Oftentimes I move it to the bottom of the list to get it out of my way. But this black here will overprint. If you want a black that does not overprint, you can just create a new swatch. That's black, 100% K. That will knock out. This black will knock out. This one will overprint. Okay, anyways, there's some times where you do want the black type to knock out, and that's when you have really large black type that's kind of covering half of a graphic. So this A here, if you have this, you can see that when the A overprints, the cyan behind it will actually change the color of the black a little bit. And that's because the inks are slightly transparent, CMYK inks. You can see that over here on this A graphic with the magenta background. So there will be some color bumping going on there, and with large black areas that partially cover a background, you can have some overprint issues. And in this case, the pre-press department would say either make that A a rich black or have that A knock out the cyan behind it. A rich black is when your black is not just black, but your black is a mixture of 100% black with like 20% cyan, 20% magenta, 20% yellow. And so you have a color supporting it. And we'll talk about that later. Speaking of registration, when a printer is printing the inks, it lays down the inks one at a time. And around the edge of the press sheet, there will be these little targets. These are called registration marks. And it's what the press operator looks at with a magnifying glass. And when they get their magnifying glass down, they can see something like that's on the right there where it says off registration, where the colors are not lined up correctly. So that allows them to know, oh, I need to move my cyan to the right and down a little bit. I need to move my yellow down, and so on. And they can adjust the inks, the plates on the printing press so that it turns into a perfect registration. They should see just all black or all the colors lined up precisely on that target. To the right here is just an example of what registration off is. That cyan and magenta is off, and so it gets that weird color shadows. You've probably seen that with really poor printing. If you've seen old comic books, newspapers with the color funnies, or just really poor printing in general. So registration is when you are correctly aligning the printing inks with each other. Trapping is also associated with knockout and overprint. So when you do have objects knocking out, you do need them to trap. So trapping is where the object knocks out the objects beneath it, but then those two colors touch side by side. And so if there is a misregistration like this, then there will be little gaps around the letters, like what's shown in the lower A there. So trapping is something that's done in pre-press. You do not do trapping. It gets done in the pre-press department, and it's done by the computers. They will do it automatically, and they find areas that need to be trapped, and they'll either choke or spread the colors depending on what the colors are that need to be trapped. Essentially, the lighter color will adjust to the darker color. That way you don't get a visible change in the size of something. So if darker letters were getting bigger, you would notice it. But if you have a lighter background getting bigger around a darker object, you wouldn't notice any change. So trapping is just something to look for when you're looking at your printed pieces, to check with the prepress department and the printer to make sure your stuff is trapping correctly. Over here, there is a example of the overprint versus that is why it's best to overprint small text, because here the registration is off, and so you get that white shadow there. You can see there's the misregistration when there's a knockout, and then the two types of trapping. So when trapping is there, you'll get this discolored outline, but the trap is so tiny that you won't see it with your unaided, without a microscope or a magnifying glass. So a trap is about 1/4 of a point. So if you think of a 1-point line, think of 1/4 of that is the trapping amount. So it's a very minuscule amount, and the computers take care of that.